So I was so moved by Kelly Martin's sermon this morning. She just hit it out of the park, didn't she? I mean, just amazing. I have to remind myself to continue that baseball metaphor. There is no crying in presentations. And so it's come to pass that I'm here to talk to you about T.S. Eliot. And I was reflecting on how I got into this position of actually speaking on someone who is so famous and so erudite. Everyone knows a little bit of T.S. Eliot, but we were talking one day years ago in Jonathan's Minion about one of Jonathan's favorite complaints is that non-believers actually think Christians are stupid. And he says, I don't know what they do with C.S. Lewis. And I said, or T.S. Eliot. What do they do with him? You know, so that got us talking about the similarities between the two. And it turns out that towards the end of Eliot's life, they became fast friends. They really actually knew each other. And I'll talk a little more about that. So we decided, well, in the C.S. Lewis Minion, maybe we could feed in a little T.S. Eliot. And so I ended up in this position. When we decided this fall that we would actually use Minion time to talk about some of Eliot's poetry, a lot of the faithful Minion goers, and I see many of you here, came in and said, I don't know poetry, I don't know T.S. Eliot, I don't know anything. And then we started talking about the poetry, and suddenly they were alive with comments, questions, you know, interest. He really is a provocative poet. I may, in fact, not be the biggest expert even in that room on T.S. Eliot. I learned that many were kind of secret fans of Eliot. But I may be the biggest fan of his work. I've really been following and using it as part of my life. And I was reflecting on how do you get into Eliot, because some of the people in the group really wanted to understand literally what they meant. You could spend a lifetime studying the allusions in Eliot's poetry and still not fully understand what he was getting at. The trick to access, I learned in one of the many podcasts that I was listening to, and it was my access. You find that if you read him, there are lines that will leap out at you and embed themselves in your brain like a worm, and they will grow, and you'll know more and more of them, and pretty soon a door opens. And suddenly, you're in this wondrous mansion of a brilliant mind, and you just find yourself wandering there forever. It really helps if you're a Christian, because his most moving poetry, I think, is when he really was embracing his Christianity and beginning to actually meld it into all of his multitudinous background. So I'm going to talk a little about who he is and kind of feed in a little bit of his poetry. I will look most closely at Ash Wednesday, which nobody understands. I'll just tell you that right at the beginning. He was born in 1888. He died in 1965, so the first half, lived through 2 world wars. He was born in St. Louis, Missouri. Most people think he's English, and he became English later. He was born to an old New England family, educated at Harvard, did graduate work in philosophy at the Sorbonne, at Harvard, and at Merton College, Oxford. He settled in England, where he was for a time a schoolmaster and a bank clerk, and eventually literary editor for the publishing house Faber and Faber, and he became a director there. He founded and edited the exclusive and influential literary journal, The Criterion, and had a huge impact on criticism in England. In 1927, he became a British citizen, and about the same time entered the Anglican Church. Eliot has been, and this is from the Nobel Prize biography, Eliot has been one of the most daring innovators of 20th century poetry, never compromising either with the public or indeed with language itself. He has followed his belief that poetry should aim at a representation of the complexities of modern civilization in language, and that such representation necessarily leads to difficult poetry. Despite this difficulty, his influence on modern poetic diction has been immense. His poetry from Prufrock, 1917, to the Four Quartets in 1943 reflects the development of a Christian writer. The early work, especially The Wasteland, 1922, is essentially negative, the expression of that horror from which the search for a higher world arises. Remember, he wrote that after World War I, before World War II. In Ash Wednesday, 1930, on the Four Quartets, this higher world becomes more visible. Nonetheless, Eliot has always taken care not to become a religious poet, quote unquote, and often belittled the power of poetry as a religious force. For him, tradition is a living organism comprising part past and present in constant mutual interaction. And that's where the power of his poetry comes from. So these are three of my favorite sources on Eliot. The complete poems and plays, many of you will own, I think. It's really a book that encompasses not only the poetry, but also the plays and the essays. He wrote a lot of critical essays. Lindau Gordon is one of the experts. She wrote An Imperfect Life in 1998, and a lot of my comments here are based on that. She has recently published another book called The Hyacinth Girl, which is about one of the women who had a huge impact on his life and really pretty much stayed out of it publicly. I'll talk about that a bit. So she named her book, Lindau Gordon named her book An Imperfect Life, which is a pretty good description of Eliot. As much as you love his work, you might not admire the human being behind it, you know. He was I wouldn't say a Nazi sympathizer, but certainly anti-Semitic in tendency, according to books on anti-Semitism. He was, in fact, a product of his time. But he's described as anti-Semitic in tendency, and in a century that was so extremist on that point, he's really a pretty minor character. Later in his life, he was mentored all along by Ezra Pound. He put Pound on notice that any further anti-Semitic comments or criticism of the Jewish religion was a criticism of his own Christianity, and he distanced himself from prior comments. His eccentric politics were really Christian theocracy, and he definitely understood that Hitler and Mussolini were not Christian. That was, it was very clear that he was not really a supporter of those particular regimes. While we're on the subject of his imperfections, let's just get this out of the way. He displayed a strong tendency to misogyny. According to T.S. Eliot, this book on T.S. Eliot, woman is symbolically the body side of Puritanism's body-soul dichotomy. The misogyny is apparently nothing personal. In his poetry, images of women tend to represent virgin whore extremes, but the overriding themes of ennui and meaninglessness in modern sexual love run to both genders. He was a close personal associate of Virginia Woolf in his early London years, and familiar with the Bloomsbury Group, which was known for influencing feminism and being fairly advanced in their thinking. However, he also came of age when women were often maligned for the ills of society and seldom given any power to affect them. So, once again, a product of his time. These are scenes from St. Louis that T.S. Eliot, who was known to his family and friends as Tom, would have seen in his childhood and youth. Eads Bridge, pictured here, was the first road and rail bridge to cross the Mississippi River. Built in 1874, it remains a St. Louis landmark. The great river, he refers to it in his poetry as the strong brown god, and the bridge endure as images in his poetry. His father was a successful businessman. He was the president and treasurer of the Hydraulic Press Brick Company in St. Louis. His grandfather, William Greenleaf Eliot, moved from Harvard Divinity School to St. Louis to found the Unitarian Church on what was then the American frontier. Eliot's mother, Charlotte Stearns, wrote poetry and was a social worker, which was a new profession in her time. She was related to Presidents John and John Quincy Adams. She brought up her children to observe two family traditions from both sides, self-denial and public service. Eliot was the last of 6 surviving children. His parents were both 45 years old when he was born. So think about that. In that era, that was almost unheard of. He was infatuated with literature during his childhood. He had a congenital hernia. He couldn't participate in a lot of physical activities. This has new meaning to me, by the way. He was often isolated. His love of literature developed, and once he learned to read, guess what he was reading? About savages, the Wild West, and Mark Twain, Tom Sawyer. In his memoir of T.S. Eliot, his friend commented, "It is self-evident that he would often curl up in the window seat behind an enormous book, setting the drug of dreams against the pain of living." Eliot credited his hometown with a lot of his creativity, and at the end of his life actually claimed his American roots ahead of his British impact. Pictured are the granite teeth of the Dry Salvages, a group of rocky islands offshore from Cape Ann on the coast of Massachusetts, where the challenging waters caused Eliot to become an expert at sailing. So his father and mother really liked those connections to the Boston Unitarian establishment. And so every summer they went to the North Shore and spent the summer in the North Shore. And Eliot traded that big brown river for this. He became an expert and accomplished sailor. The family had a long history of repression and judgment, as well as intellectual excellence. Ancestors on both the Eliot and the Stern sides were leaders at both Harvard and Washington universities. The house in which Eliot grew up was dominated by extreme moral views of his grandfather and father regarding transgressions, especially sexual. And these views were imposed and reinforced by powerful women, probably through prohibitions and significant silences at every turn, in every crack and crevice of adolescent growing pains. One of his friends quoted Tom as saying, "Tom told me that the Anglican Church had defined good and evil for him, whereas as a child, all that concerned my family was right and wrong, what was done and not done. It is necessary," he says, "to realize that every act of ours results in positive good or positive evil. There's no escape from that." So that's a direct quote from him. From 1898 to 1905, Eliot attended Smith Academy in St. Louis, where his studies included, listen carefully, Latin, ancient Greek, French, and German. He began to write poetry when he was 14, under the influence of Edward Fitzgerald's Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, and that focuses on Epicureanism and agnosticism, and he developed an interest in pornography during this time, apparently. He was 14, right? And it kind of focuses on the brevity of life and the absence of an afterlife. He said the results of his own efforts to write poetry during this phase were gloomy and despairing, and so he destroyed all of them. Following graduation, he attended Milton Academy, and at least one biographer said that he lost his faith at the age of 14 after exposure to the Rubaiyat. He began to search for something to believe in to replace the atheistical pain he felt inside. Eliot's biographers, they disagree on the impact of Harvard. Some of them think it was just a, stopping off place. No impact, really. Others say it set the tone and course for the rest of his life. So I assume that coincides with who loves Harvard and who doesn't. But he earned his bachelor's degree there in 3 years and was exposed to some really important poetic influences there. At that time, the Harvard literati revered Dante, and Eliot became a deep admirer of and profoundly knowledgeable about Dante. The Harvard Advocate published some of Eliot's poems, and he became friends with the gentleman who ultimately published The Wasteland. Even taking into account his preparatory school background and his learned mother's influence, the course of study he took at Harvard was daunting. I just want to read this to you. Medieval history, Greek literature, constitutional government, German grammar and prose, English literature, that's the first year. French prose and poetry and German prose and poetry, Greek prose composition, Greek literature, history of ancient art, philosophy, and modern philosophy, taught by George Santayana, the famous Spanish man of letters. That's the second year. and so forth, into ever more sophisticated erudite subjects. So I read in the Harvard materials something about Eliot. It turns out he wasn't considered to be a very inspired student when he was there. They didn't particularly admire him at the time. Later, he ended up teaching there. At the time of this photograph, Eliot was beginning his third year at Harvard, studying philosophy and literature. Within 2 years, he had completed writing the first recognized masterpiece and maybe the most popular of his poems, The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. It was published in its final form in 1917. He also became a follower of conservative views there, and he kind of supported the notion against democratic education in America. This is a quote from him: "The errors against which Babbitt fought are errors from which we are not immune. We insist upon educating too many people, and heaven knows what for." So this particular quote, I juxtaposed against some of the comments made in the podcasts, and one of the British women who was reading part of it, she said, Eliot was not a snob. You know, he gave us pictures of real everyday life, and that's part of put the magic into the wasteland. You hear so many different voices, and they're common voices. They're bar conversations and things like that. So different views, a complex man. So he went to Paris, where all complex people go. He lived in Paris and studied at the Sorbonne, and during that time, he was freed from the Puritan influences of his American roots. So he went deeper into, apparently, the nightlife, prowling the seedy streets at all hours. His understanding of the dark side of his city was deepened there and then later in London. He returned to Harvard after his year in Paris, earned an MA in philosophy, finished his doctoral thesis, and never bothered to defend it. So he wasn't given a PhD at the time. I read later he got a PhD, so I think maybe they gave him an honorary degree at some point. As a graduate student in philosophy at Harvard, to continue this, Christians aren't stupid theme, Eliot studied subjects unusual to a graduate course in philosophy: psychology, scientific method, Eastern religions. At one point, he was tempted to become a Buddhist, and Indic languages of Sanskrit and Pali, which would have enabled him to read Buddhist texts in the original. Later in life, he noted that he felt his disappointment with philosophy as a profession arose from its increasing separation from religion. He was looking for philosophy in a deeper sense: wisdom, insight, revelation. He complained about the thinness of American culture and arguably found his resonance by living in Europe and England and studying more exotic cultures. It's kind of interesting that those cultures are thought of as exotic, but he studied cultures where he didn't live. Can you read this? Okay, this will go faster if I don't read the poetry to you. I'll just talk in the background. Eliot's adolescent interest in pornographic body material was, according to some biographers, aggravated by his time in Paris. Ape-neck Sweeney is one of the recurring characters in Eliot's early poetry. A knuckle dragger, Sweeney is so low life that he can be found in the opening stanzas of Sweeney Among the Nightingales, guarding the gates of hell. You can see here Eliot's use of myth and ancient references and the impact they create. Something kind of worms its way in, doesn't it? Very interesting. This is another one of his early poems. During his period of atheism, pornographic exploration, and mental anguish, you see glimpses of his search for salvation amidst the images of despair and cynicism. I am moved by fancies that are curled around these images and cling, the notion of some infinitely gentle, infinitely suffering thing. To me, that speaks of the divine, and it's one of the earliest references to it. Others in the C.S. Lewis minion thought it was about some woman who was struggling, and it might have been Vivienne, his wife. We'll talk about her in a minute. I prefer to think it was an exposure to the divine. He moved to London in 1914 at the age of 25 and became, for a while, familiar with the Bloomsbury group, which I mentioned. His decision to stay in London and not to return to his family legacy in New England confirmed his commitment to his poetry. He continued to brood on Christianity. He reviewed a number of books about the relation of philosophy and religion, criticizing writers who tried to reformulate Christianity so as to make it more palatable to the enlightened bourgeoisie. He criticized specifically their removal of asceticism and radicalism from Christianity. It made it too tepid, too liberal, too much like the enlightened Unitarianism of his family. And this is a quote, "All that is anarchic or unsafe or disconcerting in what Jesus said is either denied or boiled away." Here it is, Vivian. This was his first wife. He married her at the Hampstead Registry Office in London on a whim in 1915. His family was shocked, and even more so when they learned that she had a history of both mental and physical health problems. And the marriage nearly caused a family break, but it did mark the beginning of Eliot's English life. Vivian refused to cross the Atlantic in wartime, so Eliot took his place in literary circles in London. They were to have no children. He and his wife at first turned to Bertrand Russell, who shared with them both his London flat and his considerable social resources. Russell and Vivienne, however, became briefly involved, and so the arrangement soured. In 1932, Eliot had been contemplating a separation from his wife for some time. When Harvard offered him the Charles Eliot Norton professorship, he accepted and left Vivienne in England. Remember, she wouldn't cross the Atlantic. He avoided after that all but one meeting with her from the time he left for America in 1932 and her death in 1947. She was committed by her brother, technically, to the Northumberland House Mental Hospital, Stoke Newington, in 1938, and remained there until she died. Although Eliot was still legally her husband, he never visited her. In 1922, Eliot published his long poem, The Waste Land. Note that it's 3 words. That does have significance. This was one of the most influential literary works of the 20th century. His use of fragments of literature, myth, and everyday experiences differs from the traditional narrative structure that had been employed by writers of the past. He does not rely on the assumption that his audience has a common cultural background or experience to connect with the work. Instead, he writes with a multiplicity of voices that eventually form a unified whole. He accomplishes this feat by what he calls the mythical method. And that's been described as an author's practice of taking an ancient or received story, so think of Joseph Campbell in our more recent lifetime, as the ongoing principle for self-standing and contemporary narrative. So he wrote a critique of Ulysses, which was published the same year, James Joyce, right? And he admired Joyce's use of that technique. It's amazing to me that these people all knew each other. The quote is that Eliot admired, quote, a continuous parallel between contemporaneity and antiquity. He uses the method himself, Eliot does, to structure and give meaning to what he calls the immense panorama of futility and anarchy, which is contemporary history. So I think this will be familiar to you. April is the cruelest month. Breathing lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain. Winter kept us warm, covering earth in forgetful snow, feeding a little life with dried tumors. So the poem as a whole was viewed as a marvelous symbol of the sense of desolation of the 20th century. It opens with cruel April. Because we fear life, we fear spring. We'd rather live in the wintertime of our souls than face the pain. Mankind is no longer sure of religious salvation from spring pilgrimages, as once was the case. This stanza, The Hyacinth Girl, exemplified Eliot's use of myth, enlivened with the power of current memories of his own experiences to create meaning that is ancient and contemporary. So he's talking about a situation with Emily Hale where her arms were full and her hair was wet in a garden. It's a very beautiful scene. In the myth of Apollo and Hyacinthus, Hyacinthus was a beautiful youth in love with Apollo. Apollo accidentally killed him with a discus. This always happens redirected by the jealous wind, who also loved Hyacinthus. The blood of Hyacinthus fell to earth, and from it sprang the flower of the same name. The flower, the scene, is a symbol of fertility, of spring. The light blinds but doesn't illuminate. It's a great experience, offering no answers. So in Eliot's own life, two different biographers read this separately. One of them said it's all about Emily Hale. Lindau Gordon has now written a whole book about it. The other one said it was really about this French friend and possible love interest of Eliot's in Eliot's Paris days. His name was Jean Verdenal, and letters that he wrote to Eliot have survived. He was tragically killed in 1915 during World War I, performing duties as a medical officer in the field in the Dardanelles during the Gallipoli campaign. One of the tragedies. Eliot at one point referred to the wasteland as an elegy, but he never explained to whom. The figure of Verdenal continues to be an unexplained part of Eliot's life, and one of our, I don't know if Tim's here, one of our participants in the C.S. Lewis Minion said he took an entire class, I guess it was Gar who said that, he took an entire class on Eliot at the UW that was all centered around his being gay and interpreted his whole body of work with that interpretation. I never found any direct, sure support for that, but a whole class. So here's an example of the many voices that he talks about. He speaks directly here, referencing the blind alley that's the 20th century. We're in Rat's Alley, where the dead men lost their bones. You know nothing? Do you see nothing? Do you remember nothing? A sense of hopelessness and meaninglessness. And here's one of my very favorite passages about Phlebas the Phoenician. A fortnight dead forgot the cry of gulls and the deep sea's swell and the profit and loss. The current under sea picked his bones and whispers. As he rose and fell, he passed the stages of his age and youth, entering the whirlpool. Gentile or Jew, O you who turn the wheel and look to windward, consider Phlebas, who was once handsome and tall as you. Tell me that doesn't grab you, especially at an older age, you know. This is taken from the tarot cards, but it's also the line that comes later in the next stanza in The Tempest, because there is a reference to the Tempest here, Shakespeare's Tempest. There's another line that follows, nothing of him doth fade, but doth suffer a sea change into something rich and strange. So even with Phlebas, there's a hope of something rich and strange to follow. I keep looking for these hints of spirituality to come, right? And then here's another one. Who is the third who walks always beside you? Doesn't that evoke the road to Emmaus for you? It did for me. In his notes, he references Shackleton. Apparently, they had this kind of mysterious figure that kept appearing to the crew of the Shackleton, but also I've seen other references to the road to Emmaus. The miracle of the resurrection is evoked here and hints at new life, even in his time of despair and atheism, in a desperately unhappy marriage and years before his conversion. Eliot hints at curiosity and the promise of more. He's a seeker by nature, always looking for the road to salvation. And guess what? Conversion. Lindau Gordon writes of a moment in 1926 when Eliot fell to his knees before the Pietà in Rome. He was traveling with his wife Vivienne and Vivienne's brother Maurice and his wife. During a visit to St. Peter's, Eliot embarrassed the others by falling to his knees in front of this. Any Christian who's felt an impulse to piety instead of aesthetic appreciation when visiting a famous church can understand that action. But in his avant-garde crowd at the time, falling to his knees in front of the statue of Dante at Santa Croce in Florence would have been more socially acceptable. In June of 1927, Eliot converted to Anglicanism. And in November that year, he took British citizenship. He became a warden of his parish church, St. Stephen's, Gloucester Road, London, and a life member of the Society of King Charles the Martyr. He specifically identified as Anglo-Catholic, proclaiming himself classicist in literature, royalist in politics, and Anglo-Catholic in religion. So this is way post-World War I, pre-World War II. About 30 years later, Eliot commented on his religious views that he combined a Catholic cast of mind, a Calvinist heritage, and a puritanical temperament. And this is great, I love this quote. Virginia Woolf wrote the following in a letter to a friend on February 11th, 1928. This is right after the conversion. I have had a most shameful and distressing interview with dear Tom Eliot, she writes, who may be called dead to us all from this day forward. He has become an Anglo-Catholic believer in God and immortality and goes to church. I was shocked. A corpse would seem to me more credible than he is. I mean, there's something of seeing in a living person sitting by the fire and believing in God, unquote. So Eliot's conversion over 90 years ago lost him the respect of more or less the entire avant-garde simultaneously. In 1930, he wrote Ash Wednesday, widely considered to be among the greatest religious poetry of the 20th century. And I think I told you nobody understands Ash Wednesday. So let me just read it. Because I do not hope to turn again, because I do not hope to turn, desiring this man's gift and that man's scope, I no longer strive towards such things. Why should the aged eagle stretch its wings? The aged eagle is God. Why should he reach for me? Why should I mourn the vanished power of the usual rain? Because I do not hope to know again the infirm glory of the positive hour. Because I do not think, because I know I shall not know the one veritable transitory power, because I cannot drink there where trees flower and springs flow, for there is nothing again. This was his first poem after his conversion. His style of writing showed a marked shift from the poetry he'd written prior to the conversion, and his post-conversion style would continue in a similar vein. His style was to become less ironic, and the poems would no longer be populated by multiple characters and dialogue. His subject matter would also become more focused on his spiritual concerns and his Christian faith. Many critics were particularly enthusiastic about Ash Wednesday. One of them maintained that it is one of the most moving poems Eliot wrote, and perhaps the most perfect, though it was not well received by everyone. The poem's groundwork of Orthodox Christianity discomfited many of the more secular literati. So most readers will find Ash Wednesday impossible to understand and explain in prose terms, even with long, tedious explanations of the allusions and symbolism. Yet many are inexplicably drawn to it. The meaning of the poem and the experience of reading it are one and the same. Let me say that again. The meaning of the poem and the experience of reading it are one and the same. In the movements of exploration and resultant ponderings, untrackable as they perhaps are, and uninducible as they almost certainly are by any other words than the poem itself, are the very life of the poem. In these searchings for meanings of a certain sort, its being consists. The poem is a quest. And its virtue is not in anything said by it, or in the way in which it is said, or in the meaning which is found, or even in what is passed by in the search. For in this poem, there is no account, in other terms than those of poetry, to be given of how it comes. So the first lesson, this turning, is a theme from Joel. The Lord says, turn or return to me with all your heart. So he's talking about the struggle for that. A rejection of the past without a fixation on the future. He's walking on a spiral. The opening lines reflect the struggle to turn to God and renounce the world, the loss of hope, even to lose hope in order to gain salvation. This man's gift and that man's scope is from Shakespeare. Why should God, the aged eagle, as I mentioned, try to save him? These first stanzas are based on St. John of the Cross. In order to succeed, one must go through the dark night of the soul, of utter disbelief, of despair. He cannot know the infirm glory of the positive hour, his death, nor can he drink of life. These lines evoke religious hopelessness. And the struggle for surrender. Consequently, I rejoice, having to construct something upon which to rejoice. He's not there yet. He's got to think about it and create something on which to rejoice. And pray to God to have mercy upon us. And I pray that I may forget these matters that with myself I too much discuss, too much explain. So no desire except for God's will, total abandonment of self-volition. That's what he's reaching for. He's reaching for perfection. The plea for God's mercy in his construct, all he has left. He seeks release from his self-consciousness, from his doubts. He reaches for faith and for mercy from judgment for what is done, not to be done again. The following lines, pray for us now and in the hour of our death, evokes Marian as distinctly Catholic. Now, at this point, the poem gets truly inaccessible. It begins to talk about leopards and dry bones and ladies of silence and roses of memory and forgetfulness, concluding with the reference of God's promise to Abraham. This is the land. We have our inheritance. And again, at the first turning of the second stair, at the second turning of the second stair, he's walking up a spiral. He's walking on the way to conversion, a stairway evoking Jacob's stairway dream in Genesis, leading toward heaven. These stanzas also track Dante's progress through purgatory. The first turning of the second stair is near hell. The same shape is self at an earlier time. He's looking down and seeing this twisted self that he's trying to overcome. He's struggling with the devil of the stairs. No more faces, and the stair was dark, evokes the terror of the unknown, reinforced by further images of dread. At the first turning of the third stair, the slotted window suggests the light of salvation. There's a slotted window, bellied like the fig's fruit. What does that suggest to you? Ripe with fertility, pregnancy, right? The broad-backed figure in blue and green with antique flute evokes the garden god glimpsed through the window. These are the earthly pastoral temptations. The blown hair is a symbol of revitalization. The speaker begins to wander, though. You can almost feel him tiring in the rhythm of the language, fading, strength beyond hope and despair there towards the end. His vision of earthly paradise is not reached. In Dante's Purgatorio, the poet is climbing in the final stage of his journey through purgatory and sees the light of divine spirit. He feels the power of his legs suspended. "Oh, my strength, why do you so melt away?" says Dante. "And my servant shall be healed," follows these words. And these words are from the story of the centurion, saying to Jesus, "I have a sick servant at my home." And Jesus says, "I'll come. Where do you live?" And he says, "You don't have to live. I'm not worthy. You don't have to come to my house. I'm not worthy." And the servant says, "Well, speak the word only." And when Jesus heard it, he marveled and said to those that followed, "Verily I say unto you, I have not found so great a strength, no, not in Israel. And I say unto you that many shall come from east and west, and shall sit down with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven." So he's disappointed at this point, you may recall, with his followers, that they really don't get it. You know, the faith isn't there yet. But here comes the centurion who says, "Lord, I'm not worthy. Speak the word only." And of course, his servant was healed in the selfsame hour. This particular stanza, with the reference to the word, you know, Christ is the word in Christianity, is sometimes described as the most explicitly Christian passage of this entire Christian poem. The emphasis is on the word made flesh, the Christ. The reference is to John's gospel, where Christ is described in one of my favorite opening stanzas. In the beginning was the word, right? There's not enough silence. No one is listening. That's what that means. Not enough silence. We're not listening. We're being distracted. No place of grace for those who avoid, those who walk among noise and deny the voice. Those who embrace the world and cannot listen in the silence will not find salvation. The tension between dying and birth evokes the nature of life as the struggle for salvation, redemption, and resurrection. The poet remains in the world, but conversion is complete now. Reference to the yew tree, you know, it's often in monasteries. We saw the yew tree at Muckross Abbey when we were there. Sometimes monks planted yews in the middle of their cloister. The yew tree in Spain has had a real link with the land, the people, the ancestors, and the ancient religion. And some say since ancient times, it's been a symbol of the transcendence over death. The final prayer begins, Blessed Sister, Holy Mother, invoking Mary. Suffer us not to mock ourselves with falsehood. The world is temporary, an illusion. Help us to see. And the final words, a prayer of hope for complete surrender to the will of God, a prayer to be instructed in patience and peace, even among these rocks, even when alone in the temporary world, not to be separated. This is part of the Anima Christi, suffer me not to be separated from thee. The ultimate prayer is to Christ, to be heard, for mercy, for love. The culmination of a religious poem. Did conversion change the way Eliot lived? We know his poetry changed. Virginia Woolf may have despised Eliot for his conversion, but Peter Ackroyd in his seminal biography points out how much she noticed a change for the better in his personality and demeanor, remarking how he had acquired more self-confidence and authority. She actually may have admired him for his conviction, even if she no longer admired his work and publicly renounced him. He had a playful side in these post-conversion years without the seedy, pornographic overtones of his early poetry. Old Possum was T.S. Eliot's nickname given him by Ezra Pound. Eliot wrote numerous fanciful poems about the psychology and sociology of cats that were collected and published in 1939 in a booklet entitled Old Possum's Book of Practical Cats. The best-known musical adaptation of the poems is the Andrew Lloyd Webber musical, which many of you, I'm sure, have seen. The musical premiered in London's West End in 1981 and on Broadway in 82 and went on to become the longest-running Broadway show in history until it was beaten by another Andrew Lloyd Webber. Do you know which one? Phantom of the Opera, yeah. As well as the poems in this volume, the musical introduces several additional characters from Eliot's unpublished work, most notably Grisabelda, who sings Memory, that wonderful ode. She's a cat of the night who is beyond her years of great beauty, is the note that I made. Four Quartets, his final great work of poetry. And we're going to talk about this on Thursday in detail, so I'm only going to touch on it here. Four interlinked meditations in symphonic form with the common theme being man's relationship with time, the universe, the divine, small topics. In describing his understanding of the divine within the poems, Eliot blends his Anglo-Catholicism with mystical, philosophical, and poetic works from both Eastern and Western religious and cultural traditions, with references to the Bhagavad Gita and the pre-Socratics, as well as St. John of the Cross and Julian of Norwich. Although many critics find this work to be Eliot's great last work, some of Eliot's contemporary critics were dissatisfied with the overt religiosity of it. Overall, reviews of the poem within Great Britain were favorable, while the US was split between those who liked Eliot's later style and those who preferred the desperation of his earlier style. In this excerpt, and this is another one of my favorite, this is one of my worm excerpts, the wounded surgeon plies the steel that questions the distempered part. Beneath the bleeding hands we feel the sharp compassion of the healer's art, resolving the enigma of the fever chart. Who is this? We all know who this is. It's Christ, right? The bleeding hands. Yeah. So he's the surgeon, sharply compassionate, a healer, himself wounded. The soul of the dark night is under medical treatment to achieve help by the act of God himself. And this is the last little bit of Four Quartets, I think. Oh no, never mind, I have more. Eliot was buried in the parish church, I'll just let you read it. East Coker, Somerset, England, his family's home of origin. He was cremated in Golders Green Crematorium, and his ashes were interred below his memorial plaque on Easter Sunday. And the quote above the plaque is, "In my beginning is my end. In my end is my beginning." He has a memorial stone in Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey, London, which many of us found. And the quote on the memorial stone is, "And what the dead had no speech for when living, they can tell you being dead. The communication of the dead is tongued with fire beyond the language of the living," right? Evokes the Holy Spirit. Significantly, says a biographer, near the end of his career, Eliot came to think of himself as not the European or international poet he'd once thought himself to be, but rather the American poet he had finally discovered himself to be all along. So yay, America. This is the last stanza, which I think is just exquisite. Innocence and peace are evoked by the images of children, and particularly images of the longest river and the sea from Eliot's own childhood. A condition of complete simplicity, costing not less than everything. Complete simplicity, that's what Jesus expected of his followers. "And all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well," it's Julian of Norwich, a Christian mystic highly revered by Anglicans. Tongues of flame, again, with the Holy Spirit. The image of the tongues of flames enfolded into the rose is exquisite and meaningful. Dante depicted paradise as a white rose or mystic rose in which God was at the center and the saints surrounded him. So one of the critics I read basically said, to truly understand these lines and all their nuances, one must make the journey with Eliot through all four of the quartets. The very last image of the fire and the rose becoming one has religious, poetic, mystical, political, historical, and personal significance. Eliot has brought together all his symbols and associations, all his music in these last lines to a high crescendo of meaning. And to suck the life out of the marrow of these lines, they must be lived with over a period of time. We are to live in God's time, kairos, eternal time, his own plan for the unfolding of history. And this calls us to reject the world's standard chronos time when it tempts us to live as if God doesn't exist. God's time doesn't reject our bodily time, it rejects our distortion of true time. Poetry calls on us to slow down, to pay the price, to understand. Patience is the virtue that teaches us how to live. A poem will often not unfold its wisdom or delight without a well-told development that expands as it goes. Its gifts exist in time. We must spend time with it. We must experience it. So that's what we're going to talk about on Thursday. And we're going to do that in an hour. We're going to just solve everything. Eliot was granted the Nobel Prize for Literature at age 60 in 1948. And that made him a great celebrity in his own time. He was a pretty shy man, very reserved, and he went almost into hiding. He spoke and he taught at Harvard, but he wasn't a very outgoing celebrity. He was in good company with other men of letters, including C.S. Lewis, who was his junior by 10 years, and I said I would talk about Lewis and their relationship. It's virtually impossible to live in the 20th century Western tradition without being exposed to T.S. Eliot and C.S. Lewis. Both men, in different ways, attempted to recover the discarded image and remnants of an older Anglican tradition, a tradition whose wells go deep into the waters of eternity. But the personal tension between the two great men was real. Lewis thought the approach of trendy poets like Eliot was clever and seasick. Lewis, in The Pilgrim's Regress, somewhat caricatured Eliot as Mr. Neo-Angular, leader of an elitist intellectual clique bent on making Christianity into a highbrow Chelsea fad. That's a C.S. Lewis quote. Eliot's language tended to be too obscure, oblique, and evasive for the more common sense and bare-bones approach of C.S. Lewis. The publication of Four Quartets made it abundantly clear that Eliot was the premier Christian poet of the 20th century. The evocative and probing mystical theology of the Four Quartets has not been matched in Christian thought. Eliot had more than paid his dues. He'd been rector's warden at a small Anglo-Catholic parish, St. Stephen's, from 1934 to 1959, so 25 years. Lewis had less and less reason to doubt Eliot's impeccable orthodoxy. And both men realized in the 1950s that they were digging in the same mother lode, but from different directions. The event that finally bonded their friendship and knit them as one was their involvement with the Archbishop's commission to revise the Psalter in 1959. The committee met regularly between 59 and 62 for 3 years, and the revised Psalter reflected their conclusions. Both Lewis and Eliot had a profound respect for language, and both feared how the deterioration of language would lead to a dimming of wisdom and the shrinking of the soul. Lewis addressed to Eliot as "my dear Eliot" whenever they corresponded after their laborious and meticulous work on the Psalter. And he also said he found it easy to love Eliot the more he got to know him. So forget all you heard about his early life. He was lovable at the end. Both men were most worried about what the revising of the prayer book and Psalter might mean, given the tendencies and prejudices of modernity and liberalism. Discord had given way to concord, and the unity they shared on deeper things was more important than secondary or tertiary issues. So back to the personal. He married his secretary in 1957. She was 30, he was 68. They're pictured here on vacation the following year. She'd been his secretary for, I think, 9 years before they were married. And so he knew her well. They kept the wedding a secret. Ceremony was held at 6:15 in the morning with virtually no one present except her parents. Eliot was in failing health, and he continued to work a bit, described in the press at the time as, quote, "the quiet, gray figure who gave new meaning to English language poetry." He died of emphysema in London in 1965. He was 76 years old. After his death, Valerie dedicated her time to preserving his legacy. She edited and annotated the letters of T.S. Eliot and a facsimile of the draft of The Wasteland. She died in 2012 at her home in London at the age of 86. I promised to talk a little more about Emily Hale. They met when they were both Harvard. He was a Harvard student. She wasn't as well educated. They kept company from time to time thereafter. She was a teacher and actress, a proper Boston lady, and both she and Eliot were quite reserved and restrained. I found no evidence that the love they shared was ever consummated. She was Eliot's mystery woman, whom he professed to love but never could bring himself to marry, even after Vivienne died in a sanitarium in 1947. Eliot demanded of Emily Hale a cruel privacy from the time he became famous, though many believe her to have been a primary muse for his genius. She was devastated when he married Valerie in 1957. She died in 1969 in Concord, Massachusetts, and although Eliot tried hard to expunge all evidence of his relationship with Hale, there's one crucial record that survived. His letters to her, over 1,000 of them, by far the largest single collection of his correspondence. Free to do with these letters as she wished, Hale decided to negotiate with Eliot. The letters remained locked in the Princeton University vault and were released in 2020, early 2020. And Hale's story is finally emerging. And of course, Lindau Gordon wrote the book that I mentioned earlier, just coming out, called The Hyacinth Girl. The letters are now, so Lindau, I mentioned earlier, believes that she is the Hyacinth Girl from the imagery. The letters are now publicly posted on the T.S. Eliot website, free for all to view. So if you're interested in reading letters that this man wrote to Emily Hale, they're all there, and you can click on the specific letters and read them and go back. There's also a really great summary introduction that is great. This might have appalled Eliot for many reasons that they're all posted. But at one point in their communication, he told Hale that the letters were hers to do with as she wanted, and she took him literally. He was consistently clear, however, that he did not want the letters public during their lifetime, so they stayed hidden for 50 years after their deaths. In one letter, I wanted to read this to you in particular. In one letter dated October 3rd, 1930, Eliot expressed a deep-seated affection for Hale and connected his love for her to his devotion for the church. Quote, "I am not sorry for loving and adoring you, for it has given me the very best that I have had in my life. It has, in the end, helped me to the church and to the struggles of the spiritual life, and in the midst of agony, a deep peace and resignation springs, not as the world giveth, but the peace of God. Of course, there were many concurrent paths leading me to the altar, but I doubt whether I should have arrived but for you. And now there is no need to explain Ash Wednesday to you. No one else will ever understand it." Unquote.